Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're really excited to have you here today. Let me echo the thanks to President Bacco, Provost Garber, Gus and Rita Hauser, the HILT team, the whole office of VPAL, and all the many people who've gone into putting on this conference today. I'm Dustin Tingley, and I help direct HILT. I'm really excited about this morning's panel, the importance of psychological safety as a foundation for successful teamwork. We are joined by some amazing colleagues that bring a very diverse perspective, and I'm sure you're going to be excited to hear their thoughts. We're pleased to have Beth Altringer-Eagle, who's the Program Director of the Masters of Art in Design Engineering, professor at Brown University. We have our own Monica Higgins, who's the Kathleen McCartney Professor of Education Leadership at the Graduate School of Education. And we have Luana Marquez, Associate Professor of Psychology at Harvard Medical School. And we are delighted, as our moderator, to have everyone loves Rakesh, Dean Rakesh Khurana, Dean of Harvard College, who will kick off our conversation with this amazing panel. And then followed by this panel today, we have some excellent breakout sessions that we are all extremely excited about, and we hope very much that you will join. Go team.
Thanks, Dustin. And I also want to echo my thanks to everyone who's already supported this and getting us here to this day. I'm a little nervous. It's such a great group of colleagues I have, and I hope I can do it justice. But let me just sort of share a couple of things. I know there's been stuff on the instructions for the folks, but we really want to make this interactive. We don't want to talk at you. We want to talk with you. So please, for all those out there, please put your questions in using the Q&A function. I'm going to do my best to moderate. I'll probably use some technique of looking at common questions that are thematic, so as to sort of where lots of people may have areas, and then if there's a couple of areas where maybe one-offs, I'll try to get those too. But that'll be kind of the algorithm / heuristic I'm going to be using. So if I miss you, I'm apologizing in advance. And we're really excited when Dustin invited us to be in this panel, because I think all of us recognize the importance of creating an environment in a classroom of trust and psychological safety. And the concept of psychological safety, my background is as an organizational behavior person. It's a really important construct and concept. One of the aspects of it that I think when I was learning about it is what's very unique is that it's scalable. People can often talk about psychological safety at the individual level. They talk about a group or team setting. They can talk about an organizational setting, even a culture. And increasingly, as that concept has gotten even more sophisticated, it's not just behavioral. People talk about the ambient conditions, the sort of material environment, the image, even how the arrangement of hierarchy in terms of chairs and things are set. So I think, the classroom is really an ideal kind of both laboratory and setting, for us to talk about this. I think it's particularly important that we talk about this construct today. Alan already indicated the importance of the types of problems that we're confronting in our world and the kinds of challenges and issues that our students are interested in engaging in. Complex system level problems, areas where no single field or individual has a monopoly on a full understanding of it. And yet we also recognize that we have a lot of work to do in this area, that we haven't made full use of the diversity of perspectives and points of view to get to those better ideas, to create the space for those better ideas as desperately as they're needed. I think a couple of, I wanted to sort of start off a little bit before I jump to the panel, and I'm going to be asking them a question about, how do you know you're in an environment or a classroom of psychological safety? What are the things that you look for? But I wanted to share a quick anecdote. Over the last year and a half, I've been meeting with a number of students and faculty who've been coming to my office to talk about, they wouldn't use the term psychological safety, but what they felt like some areas of challenge in the classroom. So on one side, I would have students coming in saying that they couldn't believe that there were certain topics being, approached in the classrooms. There was a kind of it was not healthy. They might perpetuate certain kinds of stereotypes, or the questions themselves seem to be problematic. And shouldn't you, Rakesh, do something about that? A couple of hours later, other students who had set up appointments for me in the office hours came in and talked about how they had many thoughts and questions they wanted to ask in class, but they were really worried about asking those questions. They were worried about somehow not forming the question properly, or being seen as having a viewpoint, or bringing a perspective or facts that might be interpreted as not actually inclusive, or maybe viewed as putting people in sort of as biased or racist or sexist. And as a result, they were not speaking up. They were outwardly conforming or staying silent, but they were not really sharing what they really believed. And it was just really interesting to sort of hear those two constructs, because I think at the end of it that we were all kind of being diminished. One was that there was a sense that these were seen as trade-offs, that somehow to have an environment where people felt respected and heard, and they could express their full selves, is really what we desire. And on the other hand, people may be outwardly conforming, but they were sort of not really engaging, and in many ways actually withdrawing. And in both those settings, it didn't feel like that's not why we come together. That, in our search as people who are in the business of creating and preserving and transmitting knowledge, and in the search for truth, which is what we're trying to help get our students to, that somehow we were operating below our potential. And this felt particularly challenging because we go through such efforts to bring diverse backgrounds and experiences of faculty, students together to create this kind of environment. And so I think what we want to explore today is understanding, what can contribute to a setting that improves psychological safety in the classroom, that allows people to sort of fully realize themselves. What are the impediments that get in the way? And then what are the interventions that we can use for those impediments? And then I think ultimately the real question is, how do we empower our students, not only in the classroom, but also to take this way as individuals, so that when they're in their other settings, whether they're extracurricular or after they graduate, that they're able to create this kind of environment that allows us to do things together that none of us could do alone. So that's what we're hoping to explore. Looking forward to your questions. And with that, I'm going to just start with the first question, which is to my wonderful colleagues. You can see their outstanding bios. I happen to know them a little bit, and some a little more. So I may sort of get a little bit more with particulars that over the many years that we've gotten to know each other, and others who I don't know as much about, to learn a little bit more. So I hope you'll indulge me in that. So I guess my first question again out there is, how do you know you are in a social setting, in a classroom, in a work where students are working together, that the environment is psychologically safe? What are the indicators that you look for? So with that, maybe I'll just start with my colleague Monica, since she's used to me cold calling.
Yeah, I cold call too, so it's fine. So thank you, everybody. I just love this conversation. It's so important, but it's also just an incredibly, generative, I think, as well it can be, and it will be. So just by way of context, I'm a case method teacher. So imagine a class in which you have 80 students, and across all programs I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I also have some cross-registrants. So that's the context, because I think it's important to set the tone. We have different contexts in which we teach. So one thing I look for, and I'm going to try and stay as kind of on the ground as possible, but having given you that context, one thing I look for when I walk in the room, and I try and get there a little bit early, is the energy in the room. And you can kind of feel it. And if you've been teaching for a while, you can feel it. And if the energy is not high, I know I have a little bit more work to do. I also simply look at whether people are talking to one another. And just, again, that's an indicator of, engagement, I guess. And then beyond that, sometimes actually, I don't really know. Like last fall, we were all in masks. Actually, over the summer when we were teaching, we were all in masks. So I actually couldn't tell. And it was very, very difficult. When you're in Zoom land and you're all muted, it's very hard to feel the energy. That was one of my major complaints. And so I know, Rakesh, we're going to get into things that you can do to just open up that energy spigot. So one of the things I did, which was a last minute decision, just to get them to hear their voices in the room, is when we were in masks, the first time we were in the room together, and this took a little time. I said, all I want you to do is to just say your name and the program and your pronouns, boom, all the way around the room. And I said, you got to speak loudly because we're all in masks. And it just gave them the sense, the voices in the room, I can feel that. And that was just a way to start. And there are a lot of other things I do, just little tricks here and there. I do like a good news turn and talk. If I feel the energy is down, that's the very first thing I do. But obviously it's on the teacher, the professor, the facilitator to get that energy going. But energy, Rakesh, that's what I look for. That's the first thing I look for.
Thanks, Monica. It's really interesting also that you paying a lot of attention to, even before the formal part has started, the informal dynamics that are happening in the group, and in terms of looking at the energy, who's talking to whom, which way are people's attention directed, are they on devices or whatever. That's excellent. Beth, can I ask you a similar question, and feel free to take it where you think it's helpful.
Sure. I really like what Monica had to say, and I feel like I do something a little bit like that. So I'll just go in a different direction with my answer. I think for people who maybe don't know how psychological safety is measured, maybe we'll go over what are some of those indicators. Because one thing that I do in my classroom, and perhaps it's helpful for the audience, I teach in the context of an engineering school. So I was at Harvard's C's for about 10 years before joining Brown and RISD. So I work in the context of collaborative teams trying to invent something new in a kind of technical / design context. And the psychological safety literature originally was in like the 1960s, and it was an organizational change variable. And then it kind of went out of fashion for a while, and then picked back up in the 1990s as work teams became more dominant in the way that we were creating new things. So it kind of started in this organizational capacity. And the way that it was measured was through questions like, it's safe for me to make reasonable mistakes, or it's safe for me to bring up problems and tough issues in this environment, or people don't get rejected for being different, it's safe to take risks. It's easy to ask others for help. I trust that people won't deliberately undermine my efforts, and my unique skills and talents will be valued and utilized. So I think that's something that we can also think about when we're assessing whether this is a psychologically safe work environment, is doing our best to ask those questions of ourselves, but then whenever possible, asking the students for some feedback on that.
That's great. Thank you, Beth. And I really appreciate that. I think, this notion of also recognizing the lineage from where we're coming from on this concept is really important. And also maybe describes the ebbs and flows about why did it go away, and then what causes these things to come back. What is it? And I think Alan alluded to it, and Bharat did, that the nature of work itself has changed, where we may be more intertwined and collaborative, and even our pedagogies have changed, may have some of that to do. And I know the classes that you teach, which is really anchored in innovative thinking, and kind of really the power of collective, how do you architect collective intelligence, I think really speaks to things that were not talked a lot about in the 80s or in the 70s, and now are critical. So it's really important point. And I'm looking forward to getting back to it a little bit about how you came to this, and what have you learned. Luana, can I ask you a question? Maybe this is kind of building off of and given your background. So if you are coming into a setting and you see, obviously coming into group settings, there's what's going on in the group, which is what we've heard, but then there's maybe things going on at the individual level, right? That we may either attribute to the group setting, we may attribute to a lot of other things. It's Monday morning, but there may be also things going on just at the individual level around psychological safety and how people feel in a particular setting or in a context. And I was wondering if you might share a little bit, just given your background, your experiences, as you think about how all of us as instructors should think about psychological safety at the individual level.
Absolutely. I really love what Monica and Beth said, and I'm delighted to be here with you guys. when I got invited. I was like, why am I in this panel? And I'm really delighted to be here because I realize I think a lot about psychological safety, but in a different way. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm trained as a cognitive behavior therapist, which basically means that my job is to help people understand what they're saying to themselves, how does that make them feel, and what they do. And I do a lot of work actually teaching community providers, peer professionals, how to engage with youth and teach them CBT. And so when I think about the construct, I think about the idea of, is it safe? How do I trust? I think, Beth, I really like today you put those domains, right? What does it take for you to feel safe and to trust? And the question I ask teachers is, where is your brain? Right? The idea is that often our brain is fighting between our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex, and our emotional brain. And you're talking at the individual level. If you walk into a classroom and you just had a fight with your spouse, or you got some bad news, you're going to be more activated. And so really understanding your brain and where you're at so that you can walk in a space to provide some level of psychological safety. Now, when you look at the people around you, what I teach providers to do is to really spend some time, and I love, Monica, the idea of energy, pulsing the room, feeling. And in some ways, I'm always scanning for brain, right? Somebody's on a fight. It's often those students that are like, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. They're uncomfortable. They had to engage, right? And maybe that's just their way of doing. Sometimes that's how they avoid just feeling uncomfortable. You have these students that are just frozen, the deer in the headlight that if you were to ask, you could see it, right? And if you pause in the room, those are things that you can think about, or those that are completely disengaged. And in real time, often we can't address it, but we certainly can step back after class and think about it. And so for me, it's where is my brain and where is everybody's brain? And if we are feeling safe, that's the first step.
Thanks, Luana. I really appreciate also you bringing up, like, where's the instructor on this too, because they're also setting a tone in some ways and being aware of where one's brain is. And I just got a question that sort of, I think, highlighted, I was wondering how you might all respond, where my brain was that, when we talked a lot about teams, but, classrooms are not completely power neutral settings, right? There's vertical power in there. There's an instructor. There may be people with more experience. There may be people with different identities, which have different histories associated with them. We're not going into a neutral setting. And I realized, I got one question that said, I'm interested in how you framed the question, Rakesh, about, thinking about, there's a binary between an inclusive or how did students come to see a binary between an inclusive environment and psychologically safe environment, and speaking openly on controversial or difficult ideas. And I'm just right there cognizant of my own framing as if I went into a classroom like that, that itself sets a tone. So I guess my question in some ways is, as professors and as academics, part of what we are trying to teach our students is to stretch and grow. And that's not always, it's not always fun because it can be challenging. It can challenge core views or perspectives. It could challenge deeply held beliefs that you didn't realize that were so deeply held. At another level, it causes you to re-examine a taken for grantedness that you might have carried with you. How do you prepare students for that? Because part of what we're trying to do is, we are fortunate, all of us are educators, we're educating the next generation. These are going to be often higher educated folks, so they're going to occupy positions of influence and responsibility, often in diverse environments. We want them to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We want them to learn to be comfortable with uncertainty. If you don't mind me, Luana, like, how do you begin that process? What's the social contract do you create at the individual level and at the group level in the classroom so people understand this is what you're trying to do?
That's a great question. Let me start by sort of an example, because I think it's helpful at the individual level and then at the group level. When I first started at MGH, I'm Brazilian. I grew up in Brazil, I grew up poor. And when I first started at MGH or Harvard, I often felt different in front of the people. And one time I was walking in the hallway and a colleague of mine who totally did not mean to do anything that was insulting said to me, "Wow, you look so Latina today." my heart pounded. I was like, oh my God. Immediately, my brain went, what does it mean to be Latina? Oh my God, I never fit at Harvard. I'm never going to belong here. What do I do? And immediately, I'm totally going to share this with you guys. I went home and changed. I put a suit on, I came back to work, and I was like, now I belong. I share this, and I often choke out when I share this because it really is this idea that we carry lenses. So that's how I teach this. We all have context and history, and your lenses are always trying to confirm what you believe. My lenses said, if to fit at Harvard, I have to be like everybody else. The minute somebody said I didn't, I tried to confirm that. And that's really how our bias are formed. So the first piece is just to even own that we have lenses and that our brain, to process information fast, is trying to confirm that. And then I think I urge all of us, and I do this when I'm sitting with students in a sort of, with yourself, if you were to see the world differently, what would that look like? You don't have to believe it, because the first thing is when we try to change our brain, it locks up. And it's like, no, this is my view of the world, right? Being Latina is not good at Harvard. Now, is there a different way to think about this? 15 years later, I love my curves. I love my color. I often wear a lot of it. And I allowed myself to fight with that for many years to get there. And so I often share this example in presentations because you have to be vulnerable with your own lenses. You have to know that's confirming. And then you have to help people shift theirs, but understand that by doing that, you are stretching them. I love, Rakesh, that you said, I say, living a comfortably uncomfortable life. If it's too comfortable, it's a problem. If it's too uncomfortable, your brain's locked. And so that's my lens. It's like, we're designed to confirm. Let's shift our perspective by owning our own lenses. And I don't know if I answer your question and if the example is helpful.
It's fabulous. And I mean, it goes right to the heart of education, right? The idea of education and learning is a different point of view or different perspective or different understanding of oneself and one's priors. And then recognizing how you begin to own that and in a conscious way. And I think the other aspect that you brought, which is really interesting, and maybe we'll come back to it, is the role of authenticity in that and how one gets to feel a sense of authenticity. Because I think it also relates to this other question, which seems to also be here. And, Beth or Monica, I'd love for you to jump in on this, which is that one of the things that is so wonderful is that we have often now at Harvard, a much more diverse environment in terms of our student background, our faculty background. We have more work to do, but in terms of experience, both visible, around a variety of demographics, but also not always visible differences, different points of view, perspectives, invisible differences that people may not be fully cognizant of. And at the same time, we are, I'm struggling with words here, so I'm just going to apologize ahead of time because these are hard. So, as an academic, part of what we often, and when I teach my doctoral students, is when you are looking at data, to not be looking for what you said, Luana, your priors, like confirming bias, but actually, how do you wear whatever lens you have, how do you wear that lightly, so that you can actually understand what the data is telling you? That can also be interpreted as saying, wait, take away your experience or take away your background. So I'm wondering, especially when we're talking about working in an environment where we're trying to get the most out of the collective group and also deal with as objectively the truth, if that's the, little t truth, obviously, we're all trying to work toward it, to try to see reality as it is. How do you do that? Is it take time? What's the process? Like, Beth, in your classes, I've had an opportunity. I knew when you were at Harvard, what you were doing, and students described it as transformative. And they described it, and when I used to look at your teaching evaluations, one of the privileges of being dean, you always look at these great classes and you're saying, what makes that work? But it was almost like people were describing alchemy. Like the students like, I'm not sure what she does, but here's what it is. I was wondering if you might kind of open up that box a little bit, because I think you somehow were able to get past that.
Sure. Wow. It's great to know that you're looking at the reviews. I feel a little embarrassed, but also that's very nice that students said that. I mean, I studied this in my PhD, so I kind of came into the role of teaching it, understanding how to measure this and how to support it in a way that I probably wouldn't have otherwise had. And so when you, in the context of innovative teams specifically that are combining multiple disciplines, which is where I was focused, you have more diversity than you would with a within discipline team. And when you add more diversity in this, in a skill way and in other ways, you also increase what you might call the distance that people have to travel to understand each other, right? And often that distance will have a lot of conflict. And so one way to think about psychological safety is it provides an environment that is not necessarily the goal, but it is, you could think of it as a form of fuel for constructive navigation of that conflict in a way that you get the best type of conflict. You need a lot of conflict to come to shared understanding, but it's task-oriented conflict rather than relationship-oriented conflict, which tends to be taken personally. So I think another element of psychological safety that's important to recognize, it is not an action, but a perception.
That's so interesting. And I love this distinction between kind of relational versus task oriented, right? And I think part of what you're saying is, if I could connect it to something Alan said earlier, was that people often have different goals for what they understand the classroom is about. And for some people, it may be about a certain task, which is mastering the material. For others, it may be, I'm here to learn about myself, or I'm here to learn about, and that's not always clear to people. And so you could just imagine settings in which what we're doing has not been made clear, that all sorts of opportunities for misinterpretation come about in that situation. Some of the things that I think people just described in some of the questions, these worries about identity abrasions, or misinterpreting when somebody's stepping back rather than leaning in, what that is really meaning there. I'm wondering, so I'll just own this, right? I've had situations where I've been teaching and, things were going really well, and then something goes wrong. I said something that may have not hit the right notes. The words were poorly chosen, or I didn't understand the impact that the words were having. Somebody else in class might have said something, and the fact that maybe at that moment I, as an instructor, didn't realize what they were saying or didn't know how to respond to it. Maybe I go back, Luana, in my kind of freeze mode and pretending it didn't just happen, and people are saying, wait, you just let that go by. And all the things that you work toward, creating an environment of trust and psychological safety where people have been opening, sort of, it gets into, it freezes, or it starts breaking down. I don't know if any of you can share, as an instructor, as a person who's in that, what are the interventions and tools that an instructor might have at their disposal to begin that journey of restoration of that? There could also be things that happen outside of the classroom that we're not always aware of, but you sense, as Monica said, things are just not there. And I was wondering if anybody could share that.
All right, so I'll jump in here. I mean, there are a lot of things, first of all, that I think we could loop back on in terms of creating those conditions. And I hope we do, because then we're going to minimize those sorts of things happening that I think that are really important to think about. They're just little tiny moves that you can make. The literature on psychological safety suggests that the more that we actually understand and know each other, the more we're going to respect, trust, and appreciate, and even show grace. So there are a lot of little moves as a faculty member that you can make to get to know them. And so I just want to make sure that at some point we loop back. It depends on what the thing is, right? Clearly you have some tools at your disposal, and I do a lot of research on psychological safety, but I'm going to try and stay in brass tacks here. Like, you have a board, what are you going to put on the board? Somebody said something recently, I thought it was off. I said, well, that is definitely not going on the board. And I just say, that is not going on the board. And I'm like, Or if somebody says something and they kind of, something happened, but they really shouldn't have said what they said, but somehow it came out wrong or whatever. if there's some way, or if you make a mistake, you can use self-deprecating humor, actually humor. And I'm not talking about humor as in, obviously you don't want to kind of spiral the situation. But on the other hand, I'm not putting that on the board. They go, yeah, but also, oh, okay. I'm going to pay attention a little bit more, but it does, you can take it offline separately. You need to choose what you're going to do in the classroom and out of the classroom. I had somebody who was just taking up air. Like that's an abrasive kind of comment, right? Because you're taking air when you should be sharing the space. So there are a lot of little moves that you can do. You can move towards the person. There was one time I used humor. I picked up their name card and I literally put it down. Everybody thought that was funny, but he got the point, So, or sometimes you can actually go straight for. I've had conversations sometimes where, somebody's challenging me. And I decided, okay, they're 95 in the room, but I'm just going to have this conversation. And it turns out that was the right move because people were watching to see what I was going to do. So I think it depends on what people are, what actually the comment is. But you definitely need to be able to self-coach, Rakesh, and say, I have a lot of tools here and I need to figure out what I'm going to do online and what I'm going to do offline.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Monica. I think it's really helpful. I mean, I find sometimes in those moments, just like normally I'm a good processing lots of information, but in those moments, I find myself like almost like losing the ability because it's like going into downshifting and everything just sort of feels back. And it's great to have those tools at your disposal.
You know what, though? You can also give it back.
Yeah.
Linda Hill, who, I think was my teacher in case teaching, and she would say, trust the process. You can actually give it to somebody else. It's not all on you. Somebody says something out of line, you can stop it right there. If you're not sure it's out of line, you can ask somebody else to respond.
Yeah, no, I really love that too, which is how do you create that sense of shared learning?
Yes.
And responsibility, because that seems like another prerequisite. When a real group is in a psychologically safe environment, they take collective responsibility for what's going on rather than just turn to the authority figure to sort of see that. That's really it's really helpful and to know that and to ask for help at that moment maybe also shows to the school. Not sure how we move from that. Any thoughts and letting being comfortable with the silence of that maybe might be another way. Other thoughts, we're seeing a lot of great questions here also about how do you maybe this is also related to the strategy part, which is Beth, taking something from where something just became relational and then maybe how do you get people back to the task component without sort of papering it over or, that wait, is anybody going to acknowledge what just happened? Any thoughts there, Beth?
Yeah, I'll share. I'll connect that to an answer, I guess, to your earlier question about strategies in the classroom and also to what Luana was saying before. So I really liked how Luana kind of modeled an example of sharing an experience because that's one thing that you can do in the classroom is show part of your journey in this. And so for me, very early in my teaching career, I would be doing this, but I wasn't measuring it. And so I would come to a student who, maybe something problematic had happened in the classroom and I would talk to them individually about it, but they wouldn't necessarily believe me. And so, and that, I interpreted that at the time of maybe not being seen as professorly enough because I would get other cues of that. And so I turned to data as an ally for that. And so I do a pre-class survey, a midterm survey, and a end of term survey. And it's all about interdependent work. So another key piece of this is groups and teams are not the same. So groups are not necessarily interdependent enough to require psychological safety. So when it's teams, it is. And so I do something a little bit like a 360 review feedback moment. So I'm sharing with them in that individual meeting feedback from their peers as well as from the teaching team. And even with the teaching team, I collect that data from everyone. And so it is never just my point of view, although I can isolate that if I want to. But it really changes the conversation to be about their individual learning journey rather than a personal attack on their behavior in the classroom.
Thanks, Beth. Wow, there was just so much wonderful stuff there that I'm just going to sort of, I don't mean to repeat it back, but I just want to sort of put it in sort of some constructs here that I think are really helpful. So we talk a lot about, this notion of the classroom as a kind of place for a team and psychological safety, but I think you made a really important distinction, which is you have to go deeper because not all things are interdependent. There are some classes which are the way they're structured, it's individual performance. Basically, there's a group of people there, but their learning may not be highly interdependent on each other. It may be more that they're listening to the authority figure and taking good notes, and the interdependence is really low. And in fact, their sort of grades are not dependent on each other, other than maybe you could set up a setting where it's kind of like a forced curve where it feels even more zero sum than even interdependent. And you're saying you really have to really think carefully about that. What kind of group are you trying to create? What kind of team are you trying to create? And that gets translated into the activities that you mentioned. The other thing that really struck me about what you just said as well is you're bringing a bunch of other tools that I think become really important that are not ordinarily part of the toolkit in the classroom, in terms of evaluation or feedback. So you said that you do a pre-survey, you give people kind of how they're doing it in the middle. There's a 360 quality where peers are like sharing about like, what's been valuable, where are the opportunities to improve. And then you have the post. I mean, I just think that's really fabulous. It's not the way and it's not the tools that we're ordinarily given. And I was just wondering, you said you did research on this, but are these tools, where would, if I wanted to get some of those tools and look for what, a model example of a pre, during, and post things look like, where would I go? Sorry to put you on the spot about that.
I mean, I'm happy to have a conversation after. It's kind of a longer conversation probably than this one, but it's based on the literature, some of which is the psychological safety literature, but there are other literatures that I pull from, and it's linked to the learning goals of that specific class. But another way you could think about it is there's like the content that I'm teaching. So there's going to be something related to that. But I guess what you could say that I'm doing is that there's also this collaboration layer of learning that is happening in my classroom. And I think in terms of scalability, it is more work. It's a lot more work. But some of that could be supported by some kind of more central mechanisms in a department or a university.
Yeah, or maybe a HILT.
Or a HILT, yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
there's one more piece to what I do that I think is useful is there's a reflection due at the end of the class that is the student redesigning the experience of that classroom with themselves in charge.
That's fabulous. What I also really appreciate, what I really loved about HILT and is I think, teaching was one of these things that was often attributed as a charismatic activity. It was an individual and it was kind of an art, and like people had it. People didn't share exactly what they were doing and how they were doing, and that it's actually learnable. And in fact, that it's not a zero sum thing, but it's actually has structure and concepts and ideas that we can draw on. And one of the things I really appreciate even about this conversation is that, we all openly talk about our research. We go to research seminars and we're willing to sort of put it all out there, and here's the flaws in the data, but we have, creating environments where people can share these kinds of things and have ways of diffusing and scaling, which I love. As I said, Beth, students used to say, I don't know how she does it, but you're sharing that about how you're doing it. And you'll obviously have your own distinctive way of doing it. But I think it really does make us better as an institution when we all share as part of our profession, this work. Luana, if I could ask you a question. So, when, say, a student gets stuck for whatever reason in this, and I think maybe relating back to Monica's point, sometimes you go into a room, and I was just thinking even about this opening slide that Hilton put up. Everybody looked really engaged and psychologically safe, but there's always sometimes the one person who's out there who has their arms crossed, they're slouch, they're either looking like they're withholding judgment or that they're not engaged. And yet you've trying to design a setting. And in fact, I think we all know that one person can sometimes draw down on the energy if it sustains too long. And everybody else seems to be going along fine. Now the worry is about that one individual for whatever reason. As a teacher, how do you get, because I think we all, whenever any single student is not engaged, I always feel like my attention goes right to that person. How do you get them unstuck?
If I may, I'm going to answer your questions at 2 layers, because I think to get them unstuck, you have to get yourself unstuck. So my husband is a professor of BU at School of Public Health, and we were talking about this the other day. His first class of the semester, and he's really working on his teaching. And there's this one student, and his first thought is, "Oh my God, I'm not engaging. Oh my God, I'm definitely boring that person. I need to up the energy." But he's married to me. And so he's like, okay, maybe there's another way to think about this. I'll take this on the break. And so I paused it for a little bit. So the first thing is, when we get on that fight or flight, our views narrow so much. And as you said, Rakesh, you're focused on that person, and that's going to bring the whole thing down, not just, And so I think it's really first challenging yourself to widen your perspective, to look at the whole classroom. And then how do you then address that person? Well, I think it depends where you are. And this is what I mean. Trust is not transferable. And so if you're talking about psychological safety, you're going to have to build some level of trust with somebody, and you don't know what they brought in. And so if this is the first class of the semester, is a point of data, right? You're noticing that's happening, but we can't draw any conclusion with that, because what if that was the one bad day of that person, right? And so what I might do is try to engage that person a little bit. And if I can't, I note that. I widen my perspective, and I might even bring the energy of the whole classroom up to see what it does. Because sometimes you can massage it. But if this is a constant thing that's happening, then I think you do have to approach it. It is something that you invite somebody into office hours and you have a conversation and you try to understand what's happening. Sometimes you get people unstuck, sometimes you don't. But I wouldn't address it right away. I'd pay attention over time so that you can build a little bit of trust. Sometimes, I don't know about all of you here, sometimes I need to just sit quiet and check out. It's not often, but I think respecting even that allows for that sense of safety. Oh, that person sees me. What I try to do sometimes with that kind of student is to make eye contact, but not calling them. I see you, but I'm not going to call you right away. In the first classroom, I'm not going to get somebody because they don't trust me yet. That's just my approach.
No. I think it's great. I mean, I love that it's actually operating at 2 levels, which is a really great way to think about it, because we have to think about the relationship of the group itself and how it's relating to each other. We have to think about the teacher to the individual. That's another level, and then how the students all relate to each other. I mean, there's just like these 3 dimensions that all are actively going on. And just jumping up the ladder of inference that you know what's going on and you don't without context is a really important one. There's a really interesting question that just came here, and I think it's the last one that just came up, and I think this kind of gets back to the point of the fear that many of us have. I'll just say it in I terms. The fear I have is that in the process of creating an environment of open exchange where we're sort of hard on the problem and easy on each other, there are things that are said that can really feel not only identity abrasive by folks, but identity denying. And it's not always people. In some cases, this is obviously different from hate and discrimination, but I think it's this gray space, which is what the students used to talk to me a lot about. That there's this space that it's and that's the space they have the hardest time navigating. Another student, though, said to me that that's the space of growth. and edge. So how do you reconcile that kind of area about, if I understand the question appropriately, that we may be bringing a set of norms that our notion of inclusion includes certain ideas, but it leaves out others, and that the norms themselves may be sort of there, or in some ways something happens that gray space makes some people either silently or overtly not feel included.
Maybe I could answer that with, I mean, there are a lot of things obviously one can do in developing norms, and sharing the process of developing norms with other people. Here's a starting point, and then actually having a discussion. This is all very formal, but I also think this gets to the point that, we have just such a diverse student body. I know, at least at Harvard Graduate School of Education, we are more international than we've ever been. So I said that I teach by the case method. Well, some people, depending upon their cultural context, may not want to disagree with me, and I actually welcome disagreement. And I say that, I'm very explicit about that. I tell them they can change their minds. I have them role play, I have them debate, and this is very difficult just in and of itself. So I'm just going to give an example, Rakesh, of, I think, having an uncomfortable conversation where you yourself are not the expert and it's a hot topic. So yesterday we taught, and I say we because I do view it as a collective responsibility, the Ferguson case. So this is the tragic killing of Michael Brown at the intersection of 3 school districts. So we had the opportunity to compare and contrast the leadership responses of 3 superintendents. Education operates in the United States in a racialized context. This is not my area of expertise. This is not my lived experience. So what do? I spent a lot of time thinking about how we're going to share voice in the classroom, and how you watch your calling patterns. You do a lot of teaming. So, we talk about how, psychological safety can be scaled up. It can be scaled up through teaming, I would say. So I stole a tactic from Zoomland, which is usually, you put people in smaller groups so they can actually discuss and share their perspectives. Much harder when you've got 80 people. So I said, I'm going to put you in breakout groups. And so I actually divided the class in thirds. Each group took one perspective of one superintendent, and then I gave them good old flip charts and lots of colored markers. I told them to move, not sit next to people that they were normally talking to in a turn and talk. And then I gave them specific things that they were going to talk about and share about, put them all along the back wall, had them walk around. And then the question afterwards was, what surprised you? What had you not thought about? And then again, very careful with my calling patterns. The point is, I'm trying to link in with the theme of the conference of teams and teaming, and saying this is a way of actually creating smaller communities in which people can share their different perspectives on, to pick up on Beth's comment, a common text. We call it a common text, a common task, because I'm giving them the task. So we're all talking about the same thing, but from different perspectives. And again, saying you're welcome to change your mind. In fact, inviting that. And I don't know if that's helpful, but it's not all on the faculty member. I think you can share it, and there's some creative ways to do it, even when the conversation is really uncomfortable and difficult.
I really appreciate, Monica, you sharing that, and really the specifics of that, because the fact that you basically saying, okay, here's these 3 superintendents, take their perspective, not saying this is your perspective, but take their perspective. And what was the sense making that they got to say what they did or didn't say what they did? And if we think that one of our goals, if we're really serious that one of our goals, rather than just like, these are just words on the wall or things we put on a marketing brochure for colleges and universities, is that we're trying to educate citizens and citizen leaders for society in a diverse society, then deepening the wells of empathy of our students is so important. And the only way you can deepen empathy is by having people take on a perspective that's not their own, right? Doesn't mean that you are agreeing with it. It doesn't mean you're validating, but you're trying to understand how could somebody have this perspective, and you're humanizing it. And I just think that that technique may be a lot easier in some ways, because you're actually, if it can feel fraught otherwise, to some of the earlier comments and questions, one way is, just asking people to take on this perspective. I think the case method, and what's also what this notion of kind of disembodying something like into a common text, is also an interesting way in which, it allows for a little bit of objective detachment, maybe in some ways in the situation and things like that. So I just found that really, really helpful. And on, and at the same time, enlarging our circle of we at the same time, because nobody wants, well, I think we all want a better society. We want a more equitable and fair society. We want a society that, in which everybody is flourishing, whatever their identities that they can be in those. So I think there's often a lot of implicit agreement in the classroom on that. How we get there is often where there's a lot of, different points of view. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Monica, because I think that is just a really, really great example of concrete techniques that we can use. One question, which as we're sort of, I want to keep the conversation going, conscious of time. Monica, you also brought up, like, you were using Zoom, like we're borrowing from Zoom some of the learnings that we had, and at the same time, we all know we missed the in-person learnings. So as we are doing this session on in a virtual platform, what were the big takeaways from Zoom that we learned that were helpful to creating psychological safety, that I think we can bring into the classroom or amplify if we happen to be teaching a hybrid or interactive class? And I was wondering if folks might want to share that anywhere from Luana. I don't know if you had to do your clinical meetings virtually some cases. Beth, I have no idea how you could have possibly run your class on Zoom, because I know, at least I remember what your classes were like. Monica, you and I share the background of case studies and things like that. So I think I know how we started adapting, but I'm going to come back to you since you already started sharing. But I don't know if Luana or Beth, if either of you could share a little bit, what were the learnings that you've brought with you from that?
Yeah, we actually, gosh, it was sort of a traumatic transition, wasn't it? but we adapted quickly, and there are a lot of tools available for collaborative design work that happened to be pretty mature at that time. So, many of you have probably seen Figma really took off, recently got bought by Adobe, and Miro, lots of these tools that would allow collaboration remotely. They're not the same, but they're not that bad. And I think also it's useful to touch base with what our students are using. I think they are pretty, native with these technologies of remote communication and pretty nuanced about how they use them. And so just trying to kind of build according to what they're already doing. Disengagement is, I think, an even bigger problem remotely because it's harder to spot. And, I don't pretend to be expert on that. I think having individual check-ins, 30-minute meetings at the kind of midway and the end was really useful for that. But labor intensive if you have a really large class.
Thank you. Yes, the Figma, I saw that the other day, was started by a Brown undergrad. So that was really, really interesting. Luana, how did you, what learnings did you take away from the virtual world?
I mean, twofold. In the clinical work, it was really, patients that I already had, I think was a little easier transition because you had a relationship. I think with new patients, it was a little bit of like, how do you get to know somebody in such an intimate relationship, right? And the reality is it works. But what I did is slow down how I ran my sessions. And I'm a cognitive behavior therapist, and I believe that my job is to work myself out of a job. And so I tend to move people along, but it's not advantageous in a space like this. The other thing that I forced early on with my team was to have 15 minutes between Zooms. I did that within 2 or 3 months before people were talking about it, because my brain locked. And I was like, and so when I'm in the office now, I still make people sort of like have some, let's not do things back to back. It's not good for our brain, right? And I think for presentations, it really was something that I had to work hard. Like, how do I make slides so much more engaging? How do I engage the audience more? How do I pause more? What is the one thing I really want them to know? Because I know that they are burned out from being on Zoom. And it's not that I didn't think about that before, but I think it solidified this idea of like, what is my message, to whom I'm giving, and how to sort of narrow it, because people were burned out about it. And I think those were good lessons for me.
Really helpful. I really love the idea of like slowing the movie down. And also, I also just want to double click on what you just said. Like, our job is to like empower our students. And I think it goes back to kind of, I think, the other earlier idea that, you know, we used to have this charismatic model of the teacher and the sage on the stage. And actually, the great teachers are empowering students. Students believe they're doing it themselves. And then they carry that with them for their lives, which I think is one of the greatest gifts, because they'll bring that into their laboratories and their law firms, their communities, wherever they are, those experiences and those techniques. And I guess it does become a question about like how to also we not only use these techniques to further our teaching goals, but how we use them to how do we get students to adopt them as habits, habits of the way they kind of work with others and work through groups. Monica, what were some other lessons?
Yeah. So I'll name 3 things so that I did in Zoomland that I still do. So one of the things that we know happened during COVID times, and certainly still, is that people were craving connection. And so what I did was these quick check-ins to really get to know the students. They were 10 minutes back to back. And I got information from them beforehand. And then in the check-ins, I had 2 questions. Why are you taking this course? And what do I need to know about you as a learner? Boom, boom, boom. It takes time. Still, with my 80 students, I'm doing 10-minute check-ins. They love it. They just want that connection. I think that's so important. That's one. Number 2, since we couldn't bring visitors into, well, we could bring the visitors into the classroom via Zoomland, but certainly when we were transitioning back, we couldn't. And I felt that it was really important for us to connect to practice. So we started a podcast. We're on our 53rd episode, and it's called A608 After Hours. It's our course is A608, and we're continuing it. And the reason we're continuing it is this idea of connecting the students, again, this connection, which I do think makes people feel more psychologically safe, motivated, and engaged in the work. And so here's the piece that's interesting, which we were able to do, and we really had to push ourselves through technology, is to have discussion posts in any format they wanted, to draw a picture, to do, you know, whatever, read a poem, et cetera, and so on, and really very much kind of anti-racist teaching, really trying to change our own practice of always the written word. We had the tools, and we were pushed to do that during the pandemic. This was also a period, obviously, of racial reckoning in the United States. And so taking that practice and continuing that practice actually is something we're still doing it, and we will do it. And the third thing, which I already mentioned really, but obviously in Zoom times, we can do the breakout sessions, have our note catchers, and it creates psychological safety. Why? Because everybody all of a sudden has a voice, has a place to put their comments. So back in the classroom, I share the pit a lot more. So I let people actually come down and, heaven forbid, write on the board or give them, you know, this chart paper and so forth. And it's just much more collective, which it was in Zoomland. And I think, to your point, Rakesh, it's much more tempting to go back to Sage on a stage, and we shouldn't go back there. So anything I can do to share and create that collective accountability that I learned from teaching online, I'm trying to be creative and figure out how to bring that back into the classroom.
I really appreciate that. And, you know, one thread that really just among many that connects the 3 perspectives that actually, I think almost in some ways, I want to say the values that you three bring to teaching is that it's by the end of a class or a course, your goal is to be teaching from behind. Like that actually it's the student in the pit. The person doesn't need to come to sessions anymore. They have now taken ownership of their ideas and their shared responsibility. I mean, it's really interesting that the philosophy is, I think, just as important to call it, which is how do we get to a place where if we've really done our job well, by the time we're finished with the class in a semester or by the time students graduate, they're empowered to actually be upfront. I really appreciate that, because I think it is a kind of paradigmatic shift a little bit about how we sort of normally recognize expertise, which experiences are valid. It actually, there's a nice question that just came earlier about both, how do we think about more democratic ways of thinking about the classroom? And I think kind of alludes to earlier on, just describing this, there's a hierarchy in classroom just because somebody's evaluating and somebody's being evaluated, right? There's a grade, and obviously people with different, salience on that. Part of this is like, what are the democratic models of things? And you each have shared some things. I'm just wondering, just because that question was so interestingly worded, other techniques about this kind of democracy, empowerment, using the student experience, things that are tips people have?
I tell them they can change their mind. You can always change their mind. I also tell them I am always going to play the other side. So whatever you say, I'm just going to play the other side. Why? Because I want to challenge our underlying assumptions and beliefs. And I expect that you will do the same. So I encourage disagreement, but I also try as best I can to role model that. And then to the point about experiences, I ask simple questions that are very difficult to answer sometimes, which is, have you ever seen this before? And then I have them do a turn and talk so they can share quietly, or more quietly than with 80 people, right? With somebody sitting next to them. So they bring they bring their own lived experience and connections to whatever's happening in the classroom, back to their own practice and to their self-reflection, to Luana's points about the importance of that for all of us.
Thank you. Anything else to add on that?
Yeah, so I'll riff on that a little bit. So I think we've tried to do this a little bit in the call in different ways, as modeling that kind of the sort of starting humility and acknowledging our own lenses. I really like the use of that word, because lenses, there's no right lens. There can be many lenses. And sharing information about our own personal and work preferences, and kind of making space for the students to do the same, and modeling through ourselves as a fundamental curiosity for understanding other people's lenses. But yeah, I think
that's great.
That's a great starting point.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. I mean, I think, it's interesting. Again, part of what we're trying to do, I think we're sort of saying that this form of psychological safety is not actually about, it's actually may even be a precondition to learning, in some ways, like real learning and real growth. And, Monica, a version of what you just said, I often ask for students. I've been doing this these last few months. And last month I was sitting at a dinner with a number of students, and I asked them, can you tell me something that you have changed your mind about in the last 2 years? They had a very difficult time coming up with something. I mean, one student said, I thought Pluto was a planet, but I mean, that was like, I said, can you just, one thing that you've meaningfully changed your mind about in the last year? And so, just to set the context, these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds who've been in college for a couple of years. And the response is like, many of our students have these ambitions for changing the world. They want to restore, and repair the environment. And one of my colleagues said, like, how do you think you're going to persuade other people about that if you have never been persuaded about something yourself? I mean, you could hear a pin drop.
I love that question. That's a great starting question for the semester.
Yeah, and so what I think brings us to even this conversation is that this is like what we're trying to figure out in to make full use of our diversity of backgrounds and experience that we have, and the kind of problems that our world is, confronting, it requires a different kind of conversation. It's not about avoiding the topic, it's about getting to it in a different way. It's about working differently. It's not about being less in support of the things we believe, but how do we work differently to actually make further progress on those things? And I think maybe part of what I'm also hearing, and I don't want to impose, we need to share these goals with our students. That maybe some of what I'm hearing, and I don't want to, again, impose too much, is framing the importance of framing why we're doing what we're doing, why we're taking the pedagogy, why we're doing this approach, that it's a means of getting to better answers. It's a means of figuring out what we really believe in. I love, Monica, what you said, I'm going to challenge, so you can actually, are you just reciting, the last thing you heard, or do you really believe what you really just said? It's a way of showing respect for differences, because if you don't actually have an environment where people can express themselves, the original form of oppression was actually creating an environment where people couldn't express themselves, but accompanying that with discussions and dialogue about responsibilities when you participate, and the responsibilities for inclusion and the responsibilities for harm. And so being mindful of one's kind of approach, so you don't get to a place where you're not thinking about you're not just saying something for something's sake. You're actually thinking about how does this move our project, our goal further along in a way that's helpful. I think these things are just sort of themes that are coming out for me. That one thing about norms is that when you have a diverse group of people, you can't take for granted that people actually already agree on the norms, or they even know what the norms are. And part of it is we may have to just set those conditions a lot earlier on and be very explicit rather than let them just sort of evolve organically or implicitly. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk so much, but it's just, I've been taking a lot of notes as people have been speaking, and these are sort of like buckets that things are sort of populating in. Any other thoughts, reflections, questions, ideas? I'm trying to multitask right now, so I've got 2 minutes left. So
I might riff just briefly on what you were saying there. So this concept is also really related to productivity toward a collaborative goal. So sharing the intent of your goal and leaving enough conversation where you can solicit input from everybody else and agree on that shared goal is really important to do at the start.
Yeah. Other final thoughts?
I'd say is, and I don't mean to be controversial in the end, but I love your question about, when was the last time you changed your mind? But in that question, there's an assumption that somebody actually thought you to change your mind, right? Growing up in some cultures, you're supposed to see the world a certain way. And yeah, you may be at Harvard, but like there's that lens again. And so I think even considering, like, has anybody actually taught you how to do that? It's an interesting idea.
You're so right about that. Like that's even like part of the goal of education is not explicitly understood, because it may be a cultural form of Western education, right? Built around kind of individualism and built around kind of the idea of, thinking for yourself, right? Whereas that may not be a shared value. I love that. Monica?
I think you just changed his mind.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go. The only thing I was just going to add is I used to think, we sometimes do this exercise. I used to think that teaching well meant that you didn't need to tell students why you were doing what you were doing, that somehow you just went from one discussion pastor to the next. And one of the things that I learned, to Luana's point about slowing down when we're in Zoom land, is that actually being more what we used to call directive and being more explicit about why you're doing what you're doing is actually not only fine to do, it's helpful.
Yeah.
And I do think it creates psychological safety.
It's democratic and transparent too, right? Like then nobody feels manipulated. They actually feel like they're going along. I'm just going to say, I'm going to go back to the wordings that, that opened up this conversation from, Bharat, President Bacow, Alan, Dustin, that, one of the things I think maybe what we've also found common ground is that students are often looking for signals that the instructors are aware of their responsibilities and understand, and if you can create that environment where students understand the goals of the class, and that they can trust that the instructor is aware of the responsibility, there's a lot of grace that exists in that space for everybody, that we're all doing this together and none of us are perfect at it, and we're working together because the stuff we're working on is really hard and really difficult, but we wouldn't need to do that. We're doing this toward that end, Beth, right? Toward that higher productivity, to these goals and values that we share. I just want to thank you all. It has been such an honor. I was so intimidated, and you created an environment of psychological safety for your moderator. Thank you. And I think we got wonderful questions. I'm so grateful to everybody who has been putting these fabulous questions. I'm sorry if I missed any or didn't give it the attention it deserved. But one of the good things is I know we have these conferences quite often. And I'm always, I think all of us are scholars whose emails are available. And so if people want to follow up, I love the links that have been put in for the material that Hilt has put together. So Dustin, can I throw the ball back at you now?
Yeah, everyone, that was amazing. I really enjoyed the conversation. I definitely have some things that I'm just excited to take away from it, and thinking about the group work that I'm trying to facilitate and teamwork that I'm trying to facilitate in my own courses. So this is great. Everyone, we have an amazing lineup coming later today that builds on the success of this morning. Breakout sessions on designing group projects for engaged scholarships, learning and working together, approaches to collaborative assessment and peer feedback, facilitating discussion around opposing views. So this is very exciting morning and afternoon we have for you coming up. All the links and whatnot are in your registration emails. And let me just give a snapping applause to our amazing panelists and facilitator, Dean Khurana. Again, all thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you in the subsequent sessions.